Alba Ribera Martínez, Emmett Thomas, Friso Bostoen, thank you very much for agreeing to discuss this topic within this Digital Markets Research Hub. The topic of today's conversation is the boom in video gaming industry, the boom itself, the regulatory response, which we witnessed from different jurisdictions. So we will try to somehow to unpack these matters, which are still for many of us are rather, unknown or only intuitively known from headlines. And you three had many occasions to comment, to reflect upon these issues in the past. There are several events taking place these weeks and months within different competition law and policy clusters. And it's a pleasure to invite you to discuss these issues within this format. But I propose, before reverting to purely competition matters, maybe we can start with kind of broader clarification. What is at stake? Why the industry is so powerful? Why everybody is speaking about it? And we have Emmett Thomas, who looks at these problems from IP perspective, but also from kind of broader socio-legal as well. Emmett, let us start with you, please.
No, thank you very much, Oles, and to everyone for being in this discussion. It's really lovely to see everyone's faces, such wonderful colleagues. So first, if I'm thinking about the analytical view, in some ways I think my expertise in IP isn't completely irrelevant, even though we're looking more at kind of competition and antitrust external sort of regulation at the moment. Gaming is a very IP intensive industry. We trade in copyright, we trade in patents. And certainly a lot of the conversations that are happening around games and competition law is about things like title exclusivity, what platforms get to host what games, are we allowed to do crossplay, and these are all IP adjacent issues. But I think in IP, we're mainly concerned with game rights holders and about how they can distribute their games. And for that reason, we can be quite short-sighted. We focus a lot on just rewarding things like creativity and innovation in the market. And if that's happening, we tend not to ask bigger questions about the actual kind of diversity and availability of the content and whether big and small players on that market have equal sort of opportunity of access. So AAA developers who are creating your big blockbuster games like Call of Duty and World of Warcraft, or your smaller independent studios that are, creating things like Stardew Valley and Disco Elysium, that are sort of one-man armies or one-person armies, if I'm not using gendered language. So I think there's kind of questions about meaningful participation in a vibrant and attractive gaming culture that IP doesn't really address. And I think that's why competition now is being seen as sort of the silver bullet, because you deal with these kind of questions and concepts. And I don't think that we can ignore the influence of power in the games market now, which is why it's been so topical. So I think that we'll probably talk a lot about Microsoft today, between their leverage in other software markets, their dominance in cloud gaming. More widely, we're seeing a trend towards this very consolidated, kind of vertically integrated ownership structure in the games market, and the erosion of that developer-publisher divide in the industry, where there's the people who create the games and there's the people who publicize them. That's starting to erode. So there's a kind of risk here to cultural diversity, the availability of smaller players to compete with the Microsofts of the world. And now, just for my kind of brief view as a gamer, so candidly, the AAA blockbuster games industry is completely broken. So when I look at this tentative suggestion from the CMA, for example, that the Microsoft Activision merger deal could harm UK gamers, I think UK gamers are already being harmed. I guess it's just to what extent that might be more. And this is the reason why my academic and personal experiences don't always match. So from my perspective, Microsoft here are buying one of the worst gaming companies in terms of their behavior, both in and out with the company. Their brand can't be more ruined than it already is. There's a time where I, as a gamer, would have begged Microsoft to buy Activision Blizzard because that change would have been better than the status quo. And that's leaving aside those horrid allegations of, sexual harassment and laying off loads of workers. They already have a track record of really harmful pricing behaviours, reduced ranges of games and poor quality games when we leave them completely to their own devices. So they have things like in-game microtransactions and loot boxes, things that have been getting them allegations of encouraging gambling behaviour in children, content behind paywalls when you've already bought the premium versions of the product. We've seen that with the Star Wars Battlefront game and the Darth Vader microtransactions. We see franchises that have kind of been beaten to death, like Call of Duty, whilst other kind of beloved IP has been withheld. So people like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and Activision Blizzard, they never really acted on them for a long time. And then also some bigger issues with quality, like simple bug fixes and abandoning support on certain devices like mobile or console. So I think when the CMA have been saying these are the risks for the gamer, that's also the existing reality. But I don't think Activision Blizzard are alone in that. EA, Ubisoft, these companies are having the exact same thing. And that's why I'm sort of saying it's a trend with AAA companies across the board. But I guess that's why this conversation is important, because I think gaming is long overdue its reckoning for all of these reasons, and that's why it's been so kind of topical. So all this to say, these conversations are definitely welcome, both for the academic inmate and the gamer.
Yeah, this is impressive. How many aspects can you somehow problematize within this industry? And thank you very much, Amy, for providing us with this, background, which is not necessarily familiar for people who are mainly focused on competition related aspects of the stuff. But we mainly focus on competition issues. And if I may ask Friso, maybe you can somehow summarize to us again, without looking into details, which we will be discussing later in this conversation, the main stakes, the main stakeholders, what is behind this big discussions?
Yeah, happy to do so. Well, first of all, thanks for the invite, and I'm happy to be in such good company. The references to Spyro and Crash Bandicoot really took me back to my days playing on a PlayStation 1. Doing less gaming today, sadly, but those were good times. So as to your question, about the main stakeholders and their conflicts, I think that might set the scene well for these deep dives into the competition issues later. I think a useful lens here is that of distribution versus content. So you might know of this essay of Bill Gates that I think launched this idea that content is king. He predicted in 1996 it was that content would be where much of the money would be on the internet and more generally. I think history has sort of proven him wrong. Distribution, specifically through these platforms that we see today, has become the more powerful and also profitable center in the gaming industry, but also in general. So you can see that in gaming on different levels. So first, on the content side, I guess we have the developers who, as Amy explained, create those games, and the publishers who sort of bring them to market. Then on distribution side, we have different storefronts, depending on the gaming segment we're talking about. On consoles, these storefronts tend to be operated by the console makers. So we get PlayStation, Xbox by Microsoft, and Nintendo, with mainly the Switch today. On PC, there are different storefronts, but the dominant one for 15 years or so has been Steam by Valve. Now on mobile, of course, we have the app stores by Google and Apple. Now, this reality is sort of simplified and complicated by the existence of platform-based publishers, for example, but let's go with that as the broad outline. Now, for these competition conflicts, these also tend to arise between content and distribution, but the intensity of the conflict sort of depends, again, on the segment and the storefronts we're talking about. I guess on consoles, there's been this long-standing bargain where the console makers make a great, powerful device and sell it at cost or even below cost. But then they need to make a profit, and they do that in a typical platform way by taking a cut of sales from publishers and developers. And that sort of explains the relatively high fees we see there of 30% generally. I think on PC, things get interesting because personal computing in itself is fairly open as a technology, as a device, also given the easy access to the internet. So you could download games directly from publishers, and big publishers do tend to allow for this or have some infrastructure for that in place. But still, Steam, as I said earlier, has been a dominant storefront for like 15, almost 20 years. and it's taken advantage of that position with a 30% fee on game sales. More recently, we're seeing some competition in this market. Epic being the big challenger there, Microsoft as well making moves with lower fees down to 12%, which have pushed Steam to lower its fee too, at least for sort of large volume publishers. And then finally, the last one is mobile, and that's my favorite segment. It's also the largest gaming segment, responsible for about 50% of total gaming revenue today, and growing larger or faster than the other segments of console and PC. Now here we have Apple's App Store and Google Play, both charging a 30% fee, which is in line with the other fees I've talked about. But an important difference here might be that in contrast to console makers, they don't make any loss on their devices. Apple in particular makes a handsome profit on their iPhone, so I'm sure everyone knows. So here, maybe developers are the most discontent, with, of course, the Battle of Epic being well publicized and interesting in many ways. Well, we might go into that later, but I think an important thing to realize is that it goes further than just simple margin conflicts. Of course, everybody wants more margin, so a lower fee is better. But it goes beyond price to sort of the innovation that is possible within those structures, both due to the fees and other limitations, for example, on cloud gaming and even on the nascent metaverse. But maybe we'll keep that for later, and I'll stick to this as an introduction.
Thank you very much, Friso. And maybe, Alba, if I can ask you to somehow, after articulating the socio-legal aspect and more kind of economic issues, stakes and stakeholders, maybe we can zoom in and summarize the competition law as such, or competition policy views, maybe main cases. Some important jurisdictions scrutinize several important matters related to video gaming, and you comment on this pervasively. Maybe you can just, for the beginning, just summarize the main cases.
Yes, so thank you, Oles, for your invitation. And I wanted to comment on this ongoing cases with competition policy and the enforcement that there has been. Surprisingly, and we wouldn't think so, but there has been enforcement since the 2000s. So going back to there, but first I wanted to outline, building up also onto that idea put forward by Friso on the multi-sidedness of video gaming, that it was also originally framed in this same sense. For example, as compared to payments through credit cards, it was also framed in the multi-sidedness and in light of the interdependencies between groups of users, between developers and gamers, and therefore the myriad of concepts that we have in multi-sidedness and that literature can also be transposed into the video gaming ecosystem. And for example, we can easily portray this idea that gamers can be easily, for example, locked in through the acquisition of a particular console, for example, a PlayStation, an Xbox, a Nintendo Switch, with low chances of switching. Second, we have this that Amy also pointed that out, this process of consolidation in the market, especially with regards to the console makers of the market, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, that have triggered many of the competition authorities' alarms when it comes to analyzing this potential lessening or impediment of competition produced through these successive acquisitions and transactions that have been produced, and they have particularly been analyzed through the lens of merger control. In this sense, since 2008, the European Commission has been reviewing mergers relating to the video game sector, such as Vivendi Activision Blizzard King, and the recent Microsoft ZeniMax transaction that these three mergers made it into phase 2 and were cleared by the European Commission before it analyzed the outset of the market. And maybe we can get into that later, but the Commission tried to capture the state of things in the industry, and it did so with a quite questionable market definition exercise. And also 2 cases in the realm of prohibitions under 101 and 102, well, 101 especially. On one side, we have the 2002 case against Nintendo due to its collusion with 7 of its European distributors to prevent trading low-price products. And in 2021, PC gaming platform Steam also, and 5 gaming publishers, including Zenimax, were fined for restricting cross-border sales of certain PC video games on the basis of their geographic location and their geo-blocking through activation keys. And third, and I think that we will talk about this quite extensively, since last January, when the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger was announced, and again from the perspective of merger control, 2 main preoccupations, 2 main worries, and 2 main lines of reasoning have been put forward in terms of the significant risks that may be introduced and posed in the market as a consequence of this merger, the 69 billion merger. And it also indicates a path towards sophistication in the antitrust consideration of the industry. On one side, there is a risk that these important players, such as Microsoft, due to their size and their weight in the industry, will be capable of foreclosing access to their own game titles. For example, in the case of Microsoft, for Activision Blizzard's game titles, be that directly by imposing exclusivity on their games, or through imposing unequal conditions upon their access. In the video gaming industry, these conditions are particularly relevant insofar as content disparity and also releasing a game days before that same release is made in another platform is also an important driver of the consumer and the user base to the prevalent platform. And on the other side, the merger has opened up also this discussion about cloud gaming services, insofar as its introduction and development may open up the market quite a lot, because it will allow that these barriers that may be posed across platforms may be blurred and vanish, because games may be accessed by devices which are not so powerful or state-of-the-art, for example, PC or consoles or even mobile devices. So the second tenet to this, to the concentration in Microsoft Activision, is also centered in this second thought and this second area of cloud gaming services that may be in turn completely perverted if it is also subject to exclusivity, or it's effectively curtailed in the face of competition.
Thank you very much, Alba. We will revert to some of these issues in asking for more details and some discussion. But you mentioned also the magic phrase cloud gaming, which somehow reflects upon this kind of a significant change in the in stakes and the opportunities. So it's kind of institutional change, yeah, a significant institutional change. Maybe you can explain to us the logic, the why cloud gaming is such a powerful toolkit, and why it changes so much in this business.
So basically, cloud gaming implies that games can be streamed directly into a device without the need of the user to perform that purchase of a quite top-notch, if you want to say like that, device. And it also enables that first porting across games and platforms is easier, and also that the barriers between the different platforms and thus the capacity of those competitors to foreclose their own titles is eliminated. So it's also an option of change to open up that market, but also if it's only developed in the hands of one of the main players, it can also become quite risky.
Thank you very much. I mean, what are your views on cloud gaming, and how significant the risk which Alba mentioned is in your view, and opportunity?
Yeah, sure. It's curious for me because again, I've got two heads on here, I suppose. So I also see the sort of, I was surprised in some ways when cloud gaming took off in the way that it has, because gaming more so than film or TV or music is a very bandwidth intensive activity. So in a very logistical sort of, beaming the game to your device thing always seemed like a very futuristic, lofty goal, but it's a reality now. And on the one hand, I see the opportunities for the consumer in terms of Xbox's Game Pass, which is sort of, integrated onto the Xbox system, but also, you could in theory access it from your PC, and that turns gaming into the sort of Netflix of gaming, where you can, directly stream games without having to download them. You take away that intensity on your hard drive, and the hardware can develop more, I guess, creatively and innovatively without the demand for that kind of huge memory capacity. So in some ways, like for the consumer, that's quite exciting. But I also think that there's a risk that the people who are facilitating cloud gaming just now, so the Microsoft of the world, basically 60 to 70% of the game cloud service, and I think that's probably right after Stadia sort of collapsed, is that they've become the mediators for what games are going to be put on those services and what games are kind of, going to be facilitated and invested in from their point of view. So it's kind of creating this walled garden a little bit, because the only companies now that can afford to do these big services are the Microsofts of the world, the Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world. It's a bigger question of big tech, I think, at that point.
And you mentioned the collapse of one of the biggest rivals of Microsoft, and which raises immediately several questions going beyond today's discussion. But it's interesting to observe that these situations happen, and they can have significant impact on the industry and beyond. Friso, you mentioned that in the context of the emergence of cloud gaming, we face new interesting questions about market definition, how to define product market when we have such different instruments at first glance, and maybe they are substitutable. To what extent? Can you reflect upon this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, cloud gaming is across platforms. You can use it on your PC and on mobile. There's some restrictions on mobile, but maybe that's for another question. And so you see in these the different merger decisions we've had that Alba listed helpfully, but also in the Epic versus Apple case, for example, in the United States. So there's this tendency to define markets, or at least if you're the commission, suggest that markets might be sort of divided along the segments of gaming, so console gaming, PC gaming, and mobile gaming. But every time the commission suggests that, or the judge in California sort of established that pretty firmly, there's always the caveat that due to new innovations, those boundaries might be blurring, and the market could look different in the future, say in 5 or 10 years. And I think cloud gaming, or more generally cross-platform gaming, is a real contributor to that. So some non-cloud games are available across platforms. Say for Epic's Fortnite, you can play on every platform except now iOS, because it's been kicked out of the App Store. Well, I guess you can still play it if you downloaded it before they got kicked out. But so that's one of these innovations. Cloud gaming, in a similar way. I mean, if you get a cloud gaming subscription, you could play it across platforms. So these two developments blur the lines a bit. I think the judge in California and the commission in its more cautious statements are right to say these segments are still separate, but there's definitely, I mean, things that become difficult to categorize. Also, if you look at Nintendo's Switch, for example, it's this handheld device that we think of typically, or I think of as a console maybe first, also because it's coming from Nintendo, I guess, which has been making consoles, well, including portable ones such as the Game Boy. But at the same time, it might also be something of a substitute for, say, my iPhone that I play games on. Might be a bit more powerful. But yeah, it's a thing I could whip out in a train and play on for an hour if I. So yeah, I think these sort of both the hardware and these software developments blur the lines between markets. And yeah, so at present, I would say they're still separate, at least for competitive purposes. I would keep them separate, but that might only last so long.
Thank you, Friso. Alba, how would you see this trend with the problems related to defining markets, and where do we go? What's the direction?
Well, I'd say that also building up on Friso's points on Epic, and also those of the Commission in its previous decisions, although the lines between platforms are really blurring because of this cloud gaming and also of the multi-gaming subscription services, catering for different games for a single price, they will also have to maybe go in a little bit deeper. For example, the FTC has been a quite good example of that when in its Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger, when it went deep and said that for the merger it preferred to refer and to bring down the market definition to not only the consoles affected, but the most updated, the most new, the latest releases of the latest consoles, of the last generation of consoles, because they don't really share their powerful element and their functionality with the previous generations. Maybe Amy will dispute that point. And also the need to differentiate the catering of those games in different platforms, and the subscription services that are a completely different, in my view, a product, as opposed to a buy one game and here's my money and I will have a game in exchange, as opposed to a full range of titles, where really Microsoft is now peaking at, I would say, I don't know the last number, but I say it's the highest peaking competitor in subscription. And it's also a great incentive for gamers to stay on a particular piece of hardware, aside from the functionality catered by cloud gaming.
Amy, you also in your studies and your kind of research, you had the opportunity to engage in communication with game developers. So maybe these reflections are not necessarily well documented or somehow analyzed, scrutinized, but you definitely got this impression about their experience or their reflection, their initial vision about the role and opportunities which cloud gaming and subscription services in particular allow them. What is the spirit, or what's the main mood, so to say, on their side?
Yeah, I think this is maybe something we can all reflect on, because Friso and Alba and I were part of a conversation with the head of games at Blaze and Griffin, Justin Ali-Carew, at a create event just last week about cloud gaming, and it felt like when all the academics were in the room, the competition lawyers, the IP lawyers, that we all had a very sort of negative, suspicious sort of mindset about what was happening, and that intervention was necessary, and that a lot of these moves towards sort of consolidation and the power held by cloud gaming services, and particularly Microsoft, was inherently a bad thing. Their perspective from the industry was almost instantly, no, this could be good for competition from the perspective of a small developer, because there's different modes for distribution, there's different ways of communicating things. But I don't know whether that meshes with Friso or Alba's sort of interpretation of what was being said there. So I would kind of be curious to hear how you guys interpreted that as well, because it really surprised me.
Yeah, and I share that. It's refreshing to talk to the people that actually make these games, and it doesn't always line up with what we as academics, especially legal academics, tend to think. I think we've seen that from our conversations, but also statements on the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger from gaming federations, for example, the European Game Developers Federation, who say there are truly concerns there, and that probably some commitments on, for example, the availability of certain games will be necessary before this is led through. But I really stress in their communication the potential pro-competitive effects. I mean, things that they might benefit from if this merger goes through. And I think some of these are interesting to me, especially. And one is sort of the potential they see for a stronger Microsoft in gaming, to especially Microsoft that's stronger in mobile gaming, because of course King is part of Activision Blizzard. So they hope to see Microsoft break up the App Store monopoly or duopoly that we're having right now. If they have more mobile games, if that's where more of their profit comes from, they have a stronger incentive, obviously, to pass on less of their fees to these app stores. And closely tied into that is the Digital Markets Act, which will allow for different app distribution channels to arise, and they see a role for Microsoft in doing so, and pushing these shifts through. Another one, maybe leading up to something we can get back to, is the competition with Tencent. Again, in these developer federation statements, you often see a reference to, well, sort of typical, I guess, industrial policy concern almost of, well, we have to make sure we have strong gaming companies here so we don't get overrun by the biggest gaming company in the world. Arguably, if you look at revenue, is of course the Chinese Tencent, and developers seem somewhat concerned about that and think, some strong European or US gaming companies might be a counterweight to that. So yeah, interesting to hear that developers tend to focus less on the risks like we do and more on the opportunities.
Yeah.
Is it your impression as well?
And also, I wanted to add a thought that, because this is something we also touched upon the other day, that there is more of a reality and of a world aside from the biggest titles and the biggest franchises of titles and AAA games. Because, for example, when you read the CMA preliminary findings on the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger, it seems that everything is going to be boiled down to Call of Duty, and if something goes wrong there, it will automatically spiral into the whole market. Whereas maybe that's not the case, and we should have a more comprehensive approach to the industry, also centering the attention onto these small developed game titles.
I'm curious for your views on that, Friso, I must admit, because that was something we did both latch on to, was where are the kind of, not like the non-Western markets for gaming are actually some of the biggest and most influential. So you have your Tencent and Alibaba and stuff, and China, Korea, South Korea is the forerunner for esports. Japan was and still is the kind of big influencer from the 80s and 90s for a lot of kind of key gaming IP like Mario and Zelda and Pokemon and Pac-Man. And yeah, so I'm kind of curious as to what is happening with those aspects of gaming that we're not necessarily seeing that's kind of highly profiled just now with the Microsofts and Googles of the world.
Yeah, I'll try to say something about that, but as you mentioned, it sort of stays under highlighted, at least in our European US focused environment. And I'm also, subject to that bias. So, but there has been interesting work, like books like Influence Empire on Tencent. And like you said, I mean, going back, a lot of the innovation in gaming was initially coming from broader Asia, things like microtransactions, aesthetic skins to be sold in games. All of that stuff, I think, was first seen in those markets and only then later adopted by developers here in Europe and the US. I think Tencent seems to be the focus because of their size, of course. It's also unclear how the different parts of that operate. Of course, a lot of that size, I understand, comes from them being sort of the publishing gate in China. So developers or even publishers here having to go through Tencent to make their games available there. So it's not all original content, of course, although they have their very established, profitable franchises. No hardware, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so a laboratory for innovation, for sure. Apparently, concern for developers, if you read it into those statements. But those are sort of the limits of my knowledge on what is happening there and where it's going in the future. I can only really guess at. I don't know if you've developed some thoughts on this yourself over the years.
I think not so much with I'm not as familiar with the Chinese market, I must confess, but I have been kind of curious to learn more about the history of Nintendo, just as a kind of like key influencer, I suppose, that has for a while became its own little bubble that's been out of, we kind of have in gaming these console wars that were always kind of classically between Sony and the PlayStation, Microsoft and the Xbox, and Nintendo and the Wii or the Switch or whatever that was coming out. And for a while, Nintendo have not really been part of that kind of discourse. They haven't really been a competitor to Sony or Microsoft, but I think that's partly deliberate, and that's been specifically kind of curated by them. They have this sort of ethos of a very closed system with only very explicitly licensed sort of providers of games, and usually family-friendly games. They kind of moved away from, when we're talking like Alba, as you say, a lot of emphasis on Call of Duty. Nintendo is not dealing with, bloody gory games for the most part. They've curated a very family-friendly image, so they've been out of the picture. But I just seen recently that Microsoft, as part of this merger with Activision Blizzard, had approached Nintendo and said, we will send you a nice licensing deal for Call of Duty. So it feels like they might be getting back into the kind of picture here, which is curious to me, because for a while they've kind of deliberately stepped aside from it and done their Mario's, Zelda's, Pokemon, and been quite content with that. So there might be some movement there from Japan as well.
Yeah, maybe if I can follow up on that and tie it in with some of the stuff that Alba said on market definition, because I mean, of course, the Switch has been this runaway success, right? I think for certain periods in time, it has outsold the Xbox and the PlayStation, being the best-selling device. But if you look at, as Alba mentioned, the FTC market definition in Microsoft Activision Blizzard sort of excludes the Switch from the market, saying it's high-performance consoles. So the Switch is a console, but then arguably not high performance. The PC, of course, is high performance, but then not a console, so that's also outside. I think technically that probably makes some sense. I mean, there's probably a reason that Call of Duty hasn't been on the Switch. I mean, it's a pretty heavy game, as I understand it. Quite some, might just be something that doesn't really work on the Switch device, giving its computing power. And as you mentioned, this more family-friendly image. Maybe they don't want the heavy shooters on something that kids tend to play with. Yeah, no, those were my couple of thoughts on that. But maybe Alba wants to complement that with her views.
Yeah. Also, on this, because these agreements, I think that were signed like 2 days ago, so they are quite new. The most surprising one was the Nintendo Call of Duty one, and it was surprising for me also that it said that it would not it would introduce Call of Duty with content parity and at the same release date as it would in Xbox, and in parallel the Microsoft also engaged in an agreement with NVIDIA to cater for Call of Duty through its cloud gaming. So it seems like there's a race for Microsoft in this sense to try to curtail all of the criticism that is directed at it because of its potential foreclosure of Activision Blizzard game titles, and Nintendo is surprisingly a means to do that. But I'm also quite suspicious on whether those promises will be effectively possible, because Nintendo, I don't know to what extent Nintendo will be able to integrate that content into its console.
Let us maybe talk a little bit about the Digital Markets Act and the requirement for core platform services. Some of them are relevant for gaming industry.
I think that you mentioned the core platform services that are relevant. I guess the main ones I see are operating systems, and app stores are an intermediation service very explicitly, so they'll also be caught. I think this applies mostly so to the PC and the mobile segment, and then most of all the mobile, because as I said earlier, PC is already fairly open. You can have your own PC game stores like Epic, but Epic cannot have its app store, of course, on iOS. It could technically have it on Android, but that's sort of been hidden. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in that either. The DMA should open that up, especially mobile. So a couple of provisions that are relevant. One, allowing other app stores, also allowing the side loading of apps. So making sure that even on your mobile device, you can directly download, say, a game. You don't have to go through an app store in the first place. There's also a provision on FRANs, so fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory app store fees. So presumably the 30% fee we see today on gaming transaction would be not reasonable. I think otherwise the provision is kind of moot. And indeed, a lot of disputes we see, of course, do qualify that fee as excessive. So that would be another intervention. And there's also some stuff on browsers that tie in with what the Competition and Markets Authority is looking at. So a host of provisions, I think, all working together to open up, especially mobile distribution, including of games. And it'll remain to be seen who will truly capitalize on that. I think, coming up with an app store, for example, requires a lot of investment. And I think that's also why developers hope that, for example, Microsoft will fill that gap. I mean, they've tried once with their mobile operating system. That didn't work out, but maybe they want to give it another go with mobile app distribution at least. And they've got something to work with. They have their Microsoft store on PCs already. So I suppose they could build a bit on that and then take that experience. It's very uncertain as to the effects. I mean, I think ideally we see somewhat lower fees. So that means game developers and publishers have more to work with, and Apple a bit less, but their app store margin is so high that maybe not, that might not inhibit innovation necessarily. And maybe things we don't think of yet when that is opened up, that we see, for example, game-specific stores arise and not just general app stores. That could be one thing. I think that's the direction Epic is thinking of going, with an Epic Game Store specifically. And of course, cloud gaming, as we said, has been obstructed on mobile because, well, basically Apple doesn't want to see another interface for apps, another sort of app store arise, and cloud gaming could be an intermediate step towards that. So they have basically banished cloud gaming, at least in the way that we think of it, as a catalog of apps that you can play immediately.
I mean, if I can, thank you very much, Friso. Ask you as an IP lawyer, we borrow the mechanism of rent from IP to a large extent. Do you think there are some structural challenges and opportunities with the fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory term as the mechanism, as the very approach? Is it kind of a Pandora box, or it's on the contrary very happy remedy, which or very useful, which can be applied to recalibrate some structural challenges?
I think I was reflecting more broadly there again when we were talking about the perspective of developers and stuff here, and what they see as important, and ultimately, like, are we, when the dust settles, do we want a market that is good for them to participate in? And again, Fran's, that sort of concept of, like, pricing and stuff like that, and fairness and reasonableness and non-discriminatory pricing was really not something that was coming through from those talks, in terms of, I think there was the feeling that the money you're going to make, and, like, advertising and marketing and everything is a whole other dimension of the success or failure of a game and how well it does in the market. I think I was kind of curious that when we were speaking with them, there was almost more kind of logistical barriers than the ones that the DMA is necessarily addressing, where I certainly got the impression that even if in theory it would be good for a games developer to have their game on as many kind of devices and as openly available as possible, the logistical barrier of porting technically one game that's designed for one device to another is actually a bigger hurdle than necessarily, making it available on that device as such. That's just one thing, but the investment and the kind of technical prowess to make that happen. For example, I'm not going to play Call of Duty on my iPhone. I'm not going to play World of Warcraft on my iPhone, not necessarily because, the market hasn't been opened up to that, or because it will be opened up to that, but because it's far too fidgety. There's no way I can control it, So, like, that's why porting and stuff has become so important, is that it's not necessarily that you can have a sort of seamless integration of games across all devices and all sizes of screens and all hardwares and methods of input, because just very logistically, someone needs to design it to properly work. So yeah, I'm kind of curious that, again, when we looked at what the developers were saying, the DMA wasn't necessarily matching with what they were saying the main hurdles were, which were much more logistical and practical. I was thinking about that when both you and Friso were speaking there. Thank you,
Emmy. Alba, how do you see the role of the DMA in this constellation?
I am quite a critic of the DMA, so maybe I'm not the best person to talk about this. But I think that the DMA will most surely affect those that will be designated, and those that will be designated, Microsoft will fall into that scope, but also Apple into the mobile device sector. So I don't think I don't see so much of an impact, but maybe that's only me being negative. Because I think that also with all of the conversation that we have had and the analysis of all of the ongoing efforts that are going on, maybe we are missing, as Amy said, many of the relevant arguments. such as the small developers, the wider picture. And the DMA is also like really adscribed to this narrower picture where digital is associated with because when Amy was talking about this front, I was thinking about fairness and contestability, and the fairness of that definition, and how that definition is not yet at least clear in the sense of how it's going to be interpreted, as opposed to the fairness relation to the unfair trading that we have in competition. So I think that a lot of work is going to be done if there's going to be a radical transformation in video gaming, and I think that really the merger control perspective is better to attain these purposes that we are trying to narrow down, rather than a comprehensive impact because of the DMA.
And if you look at the issue again from the perspective of main stakeholders, we were a little bit, skeptical about the inter-ecosystem competition aspects. We would always, from the regulatory perspective, and those people who adhere to more pro-enforcement, vision, more pro-competitive regime, proactive regime, any reference to inter-ecosystem competition where the biggest players compete with each other was seen as somehow as a little bit, how to say, maybe opportunistic or not very accurate. Friso, I'm asking you, what do you think is actually this sector a good example how we witness an instance of genuine inter-ecosystem competition where different markets, depending on where you place your focus, whether you place your focus on mobile operating systems or on cloud services or maybe on media industry, they have completely different emphasis, and thus we can scrutinize from different perspectives and come to very different results.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and you sort of can see it at different levels. I think even within, say, the segment of console gaming, I guess both Sony has their ecosystem around the PlayStation, Microsoft around the Xbox, and for that competition between ecosystem, there's something to be said for exclusives. Like, exclusives don't have to be bad. It can limit sort of competition within, say that game, within that ecosystem. But for the competition between Sony and Microsoft, they actually spur that competition. And, then the other ecosystem wants their exclusives. And maybe in the end, the output, the great games we see in the market might actually increase through these exclusives. So definitely not a completely bad thing, pros and cons, as is often the case. And then at a higher level, you can see it between the segments and those relative ecosystems. Barriers are breaking down so that competition between the segments or ecosystem becomes more intense. The DMA helps, I think, in that case, because PC or strong players from PC can now flow to mobile, with Microsoft being a potential example there. I think the DMA, of course, well, the goals there are fairness and contestability, but I think definitely the contestability goal can sort of be conceived as inter-platform or inter-ecosystem competition as being something they want to promote and spur. But I think to bridge the gap between what I said about the DMA and Alba, I mean, there's so many unknowns there. So, I mean, if you want a best case scenario, it's all flowers and rainbows, and you can make a case for that. If you want a worst case scenario, it's the demise of mobile and just, iOS and Android and these beautiful ecosystems being wiped and becoming like, terrible, desolate places. And the reality in the end will probably be somewhere in between. A lot will depend on the considerable discretion that the Commission has and how it uses that discretion. But I suppose as a regulatory instrument, it could help spur that inter-platform competition as well.
And maybe the last question before we revert to our traditional rubric of recommendations for students and young graduates. We hear the argument, the reference to privacy, particularly when we talk about issues related to cloud gaming and the unwillingness of mobile operating system and mobile app stores to allow more widespread access and more intuitive, easier access. Do you think these references are well founded? There are some challenges with this, or all business users are subject to the same privacy protection rules, and these references are rather less founded?
We have a PhD student in Create who's looking at behavioural data in games, and I think that for me is where the interest in privacy questions arise, because I guess when you're monitoring the whole spectrum of data that's available when someone's playing a game, it's much broader, I think, than when someone's even browsing a website or you know, on Netflix or on Spotify or something like that, because there's a lot of aspects of movement within games. I was thinking particularly of, and maybe this is a example you've heard of before, so but for the benefit of anyone that's watching, the corrupted blood incident with World of Warcraft and the parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know if this is familiar to anyone on the panel, but essentially there was a kind of bug in the World of Warcraft universe that acted like a virus. So when players went into a specific dungeon, they got a kind of attribute from the enemy that was a debuff. So it was kind of draining your HP, your health of your character, so that eventually over time you would die. And that debuff was meant to be kind of contained to that dungeon, but there was a bug in the game that meant it could spread out into the world, so the players could bring it with them outside the dungeon to the wider world. It passed from player to player. It acted like a plague. So there was a lot of kind of speculation at the time about how useful this data was. So how do people behave in games that is a way that's similar to real life, I guess? What is the risk that's involved when a player has a lot of time sink and a lot of investment sink in their character in that particular world? And would they actually perceive this as a real risk as they would in real life with their health? And there was researchers at the time that said about trying to get access to this data to inform epidemic modelling, because obviously huge ethical issues with trying to model how that would work in real life. And there was issues with access. There was issues with access to getting that kind of data because of the kind of aspects of human movement and everything that is more heavily protected, I understand, under sort of data protection and privacy rules. And then COVID happened, and a lot of the kind of initial observations that the researchers that kind of proposed getting more access to this data had seen manifested. So there was questions about, you know, why are there players that are working in these in-game marketplaces trying to make money when there's a plague? Why, you know, and then we had the same questions about businesses being open during COVID. So there's certainly a lot of value there in the data that's had, and the value to kind of companies that aren't even just gaming companies. So I guess I'm saying there's concerns that are well founded, but I think there's also a lot of good reasons to open it up, because there's a lot of interesting things that are happening there that could be modelled in game worlds, especially as things like VR and things, technologies are becoming more prevalent. I think there's a good case to investigate how we can open that up a little bit.
Also, because I'm also looking into privacy and competition law, and the recent developments that the European Commission has done into the enforcement of GDPR maybe are quite relevant in this scenario where cross-border enforcement is going to be enhanced and so on, and also the differentiation between personal and non-personal. I don't think whether the movements of a person would fall into this a personal data definition, and they would be classified onto the category of non-personal data. And also I am quite a pushy advocate for advocating in favor of also integrating this non-personal data into protection, because although it can bring, as we said in the previous days, this discoverability in innovation when gamers are playing particular games, so as Minecraft or Roblox, also a huge risk is posed when someone feels observed and knows that their behavior, their patterns, and their actions are being observed, only if it is even if it's only a machine that's doing that, but then we know that a human is always at the other side of the machine, recording all of the data. So yeah, I think that the concerns are legitimate, and maybe more enforcement on the side of the GDPR is deemed, but I don't really quite see the competition law insight on that.
Thank you very much. So coming to this last aspects of our conversation, you all three combine these two features. You are established academics, reputable, you write regularly, publish, and participate in different events. Your voice is heard, your academic voice is well articulated and present in the discussions in various areas of law and policy. But simultaneously, you also understand the mechanics of the digital economy very well. You know that you sense the trends, you understand them, you see the development where it goes. You remember, of course, your student years as well. So those younger generation who are currently facing, probably unprecedented spectrum of opportunities, but also perplexities, they would probably find your recommendations or suggestions particularly helpful, because you combine both worlds organically. So maybe we can finish our panel with your brief suggestions for our potential young listeners.
Well, I think if they're interested in gaming, there's so many resources, and not all of them have to be the classic academic ones, especially if you want the industry side of things. And in competition law, you're just applying this body of law to market realities. So knowing the market realities, as you've said, is the important part, or at least half of the equation. And I think there's so many great resources, which some of them you can listen to on the go, like podcasts. I learn a lot about gaming from podcasts. There's different ones. A recent one that's very good is called Gamecraft. There's also one that's called Unboxing, Play and Profit for the Gaming Curious. There's a podcast called Acquired that goes into the history of many gaming companies, which is fun. So maybe that would be a fun place to start. And if you want to sort of level up in the gaming lingo and then dive a bit deeper into the economics and mechanics, the technology also of this, some good books about game development. There's Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier. If you want to look to the future, into the metaverse, there's a good book by Matthew Ball on that. And for the more economic view, there's One Up by Joost van Dreunen. So, I mean, these are all great resources. And yeah, my more general, I guess, recommendation is you can really only start applying competition law when you know the industry well. So don't forget about that part, because otherwise you might end up saying some things that just are not really based in the market realities we're seeing, and that, for example, developers care about when you talk about gaming. So that's it.
Thank you, Friso. And you also very modestly didn't mention among the podcasts which should be recommended to our listeners, the Monopoly Attack, the one which you co-host. you have excellent episodes, and as a subscriber to this podcast, I also recommend it to peers. Maybe any word to your recommendations as well.
Oh yes, I love a good podcast recommendation. It is a legitimate means of studying for any young scholars out there. So I'll add one to that. That is the Video Game History Hour, which is run by sort of museologists, people that are preserving video games and talking about the history of them and how to sort of preserve them now going forward. I think my two recommendations for people who are looking to study this and to learn more about it. The first one is that I think in terms of research directions, we need a lot more empirical evidence about how people in the industry perceive games and the key issues and how their sort of dynamics between each other work. I think that's still an area where we just don't know enough. We have a lot in theory, but then, as we've kind of said a few times today, we actually speak to the people on the ground that are doing these things, and we come away with a completely different perspective. So I would encourage people to go and speak to people in the industry if you can, learn about how things actually work. And on that note, I think that actually the second recommendation I would have is a fun one, because it would be go and play a game, because I hear so many people now who have this very detached kind of scientific interest in games, but have not played one for years, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. We all have time constraints, but I think there's such a diversity of game types out there that are not necessarily looking for a £500 commitment and a subscription service to Call of Duty. It can be playing something on your phone or on your laptop, not during classes. And I think that level of interactivity with the game, that actually seeing how it works and why it's different from other different types of industries and cultural products, is really important, because I think that is part of the reason that games are understudied, and that for a long time we didn't really look at this market, is because a lot of people didn't play and they didn't understand why it's not the same as watching a film or reading a book. There is this level of interactivity that you need. So go play a game. I think that's my recommendation.
And if I may add, Emmy, among the sources you recommended, it should definitely mention the one which you contribute regularly, create blogs, which is very impactful and has very, very, very good reputations. We always read your contributions with great interest. So Alba.
So to finish up, it's more of a general recommendation, because I think that's the most near to the, not to call anyone old, but I'm the most near to the student phase. And I think that one of the problems that most people struggle with is getting out there. So and their ideas and their thoughts out there, and they want to do that quickly and sometimes rushing the process. And I would recommend getting your feet on the ground and really taking your ideas and your arguments to the highest level, so that you can get like a coherent view of the ideas you are putting forward.
And read regularly a blog edited by Alba, Kluwer competition policy, I believe, blog, which is a great source for regular information, the freshest reflections, and you're doing a great job, Alba. It's always important source of information for many of us. Friso Bostoen, Emmy Thomas, Alba Ribera Martínez, thank you very much for this conversation. It was a pleasure to learn from you, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss these issues in a couple of years' time, and to see how accurate your predictions were.
Then we can also do so in the metaverse together.
Yes.